Thank you. On behalf of the Helen Keller Foundation for Research and Education, its board of directors, and the family of Helen Keller, it's such an honor and privilege to be here with you this evening as we celebrate the 2015 Helen Keller Prize for Vision Research laureates. I'd like to share with you a story that my dad, Warren Johnson, who left this earth 18 months ago, used to share with me as a child. My dad was a very big part of the Helen Keller Foundation. When he passed away, he was chairman of the board, and Dad believed in the work of the foundation, even benefiting himself from the clinical research that Dr. Morris was doing. So please bear with me as I recount that story. As Dr. Frank Mayfield was touring the Tewksbury Institute in Boston, Massachusetts, he accidentally collided with an elderly floor maid. To cover the awkward moment, he asked her, "How long have you worked here?" And she replied, "Well, almost since the place opened." And he said, "Well, what can you tell me about this place?" And she said, "I don't know what I could tell you about it, but I want to show you something." And with that, she grabbed his hand and she led him under the oldest part of the building. It was there that he saw tiny cages that were rusting. And he asked, "What are those for?" And she replied, "That's where they kept Annie." "Who's Annie?" he said. Annie was a girl that was unruly, almost like a wild animal. They had to cage her at times to keep her out of trouble. Every time the doctors and nurses would come to check Annie out, they couldn't. She would scream and kick and spit. So one day when I got home, I thought, I need to do something nice for Annie. So I baked her a cake, and I took it to work the next day. I went down into that dark basement room, and as Annie lay there sleeping, I put the cake beside her cage. And I got out of there because it was tough sledding with Annie. I went back that afternoon to see if she had found it, and she'd eaten the whole thing. It was all gone. That introduced Annie and I in a way that no one ever thought possible. We actually became friends. And that's how it happened that every time the doctors and nurses needed to examine her, they would come to me and they would say, "Would you help us with Annie?" And of course, I would go and hold her hand and I would explain to her what was happening. And that's how the doctors found out that she was going blind from a disease called trachoma. A few months later, I went down to check on Annie and she wasn't there. I asked the director what had happened to her. And he said that they allowed her to go to school, to the Perkins School for the Blind over in Watertown. I thought about Annie all those years, and years later, I found out what did happen to her. She became a teacher. She accepted a job from a man in Tuscumbia, Alabama, whose daughter was deaf and blind. Dr. Mayfield stood in silence as he listened to the story. But that is how Anne Sullivan became the teacher of Helen Keller. And as Helen Keller was being considered for the Nobel Peace Prize, a reporter went up to her and he asked her, "Miss Keller, who was the greatest influence on your life?" And she said, "Of course, Anne Sullivan." But Anne Sullivan interrupted her, and as she spelled the manual alphabet in her hands, she said, "No, Helen, the greatest influence on both our lives was a maid at the Tewksbury Institute." You see, history is changed when one person says, "I will."